You know, it was just a few weeks ago right here on this Senate floor that our Republican colleagues on a straight party line vote cut millions and millions of dollars, billions of dollars back from investments in healthcare like Medicaid. And as a result, millions and millions of Americans are going to lose access to healthcare. And for what? All for a giant giveaway, tax giveaway that disproportionately benefits the very wealthiest in America. They called it the Big Beautiful Bill. It was beautiful if you're a billionaire. For everybody else, it came at your expense in one form or another. Now, here today on the floor of the Senate, we have Republicans bringing a partisan bill once again. This time to cut $9 billion in important investments, including from public radio and public television. And as my colleague, Senator Murphy, just indicated, from very important foreign assistance programs that are essential to American diplomacy and ultimately to American power and interests around the world. This is not America first. This is America in retreat, or President Trump surrendering. So, to add insult to injury, these cuts are coming after Republicans in this very body and the House of Representatives passed and President Trump signed into law provisions that included the very programs that we're talking about cutting today. In other words, this is a total switcheroo where one day Republicans vote for a package that includes essential investments, and the next day they turn around on a party line vote and erase the investments that were just signed into law. That will undermine the entire appropriations process. Now, I've been listening to comments from some of my Republican colleagues, and they say this is about reducing the national debt. Well, I am all for reducing our deficits and our debt. But I asked my Republican colleagues, if you really cared about fiscal responsibility and deficits in the debt, what happened 2 weeks ago on the floor of the Senate? Because Republican senators pulled all-nighters in order to pass legislation that resulted in the largest debt increase in American history, throwing away trillions of dollars to in part pay for tax cuts for billionaires. That bill that passed the Senate just 2 weeks ago will add $4 trillion to our national debt. Why is that? Because even after they made cuts to Medicaid, which will throw millions of Americans off their health care, even after that, the tax cuts that disproportionately benefit wealthy people were so big that it's still going to explode the deficit by $4 trillion. And now here they come 2 weeks later to pass this rescissions bill that cuts very important services and very important components of our foreign policy for $9 billion. Mr. President, that is 0.23 of 1% of the debt that the Republican senators voted to increase just 2 weeks ago. So nobody's fooling anybody when senators come down to the floor and say, we've got to do this because of our national debt, having exploded the national debt by $4 trillion just 2 weeks ago. And so what does this package include? Well, it includes cuts to public radio. That includes NPR, includes PBS, also public television is cut. So we explode the debt by $4 trillion 2 weeks ago, and this week we're coming after Big Bird. That is their solution to dealing with the national debt. If you look at the cuts to public radio, they can have very harmful impacts around the country. Because in many rural areas especially, people do use access to public radio to get alerts about natural disasters. So this would put those communities at risk, and this is part of a pattern. It's part of a pattern we're seeing in the funds being withheld by this Trump White House that we've already passed. Here we're talking about cutting funds through this partisan process, but the Trump White House is also unilaterally withholding important funds for disaster relief. We learned after the tragic flooding in Texas that claimed so many lives that FEMA failed to answer nearly 2/3 of the calls on its disaster assistance line because the Trump administration had cut so much of the FEMA staff. In my state of Maryland, a number of months ago, we witnessed terrible flooding in the western part of our state. In fact, some of you may have seen the images of elementary school students being evacuated from their school on boats. Fortunately, no one died in that flood, but the damage was extensive. And we're still waiting on the Trump administration to answer our state request for some help for those families and small businesses that were hit. Now, this is a pattern that goes beyond just disaster relief. In Maryland, we've also seen cuts to FEMA programs designed to protect communities and let them have the resources to put in place protections like higher walls so that they are not victims of natural disasters. Those funds were cut. So we see those cuts to those essential programs. We're also seeing this across the board when it comes to global health. And I'm not going to go through all of those cuts. Some of my colleagues have identified those. I will just say that our foreign assistance is not charity. Our foreign assistance, as colleagues have said, has been an essential element of our overall foreign policy. And if you talk to wise generals at the Defense Department, they will tell you that our national security and foreign policy strategy rests on 3 pillars. Yes, of course, defense and military power, but also diplomacy and development. And when you make these deep cuts that are impacting diplomacy and development, including, by the way, the 1,300 patriotic State Department employees who were just fired last week, when you do that, it's our adversaries who benefit, and it's the American people who lose, along with our allies. Because those are not giveaways, those investments. You know, if your neighbor's house is on fire, you don't just sit in your house and let your neighbor's house burn. You go help them out because they're your neighbor and it's the right thing to do, but it's also the smart thing to do because that fire may be heading to your house next. And when it comes to issues like global health and the spread of disease around the world, it's the same story. We save millions of lives, including millions of kids' lives, when we help, but we also prevent those diseases from jumping over the oceans and coming to hurt people right here in the United States of America. But this administration doesn't care. If you look at a Lancet study, they've estimated that the cuts that the Trump administration is made in the area of global health and other important investments will cost 14 million lives by the year 2030, including 4.5 million children who will die. We just saw a story in Atlantic that revealed that the Trump administration is paying to incinerate, to light on fire, 500 tons of emergency nutritional biscuits that could go to feed hungry kids. So, Mr. President, I really urge my colleagues to take a step back and not move forward with these cuts. As I said, the notion that this is somehow their contribution to reducing our national debt when they exploded our national debt by $4 trillion over 10 years just 2 weeks ago is ludicrous. But I will close, since I see the Vice Chair of the Appropriations Committee on the floor, with just a final point that does deserve repeating, which is we've had a bipartisan appropriations process. We've done our very best to preserve that tradition. But when you take an action on one day and we vote on a bipartisan basis for important American priorities, whether in public radio or addressing global health issues, when we do that one day and the President of the United States signs that into law, and then we run down here a few months later and said, you know what, we didn't mean it with respect to these programs, and we, on a partisan basis, are going to yank them away, that undermines trust and confidence in this entire system. So both for the American people and the important investments that we did make and which they will now lose, but also for the future of this institution and the power of the purse, I urge my colleagues to vote against this bill. And I yield the floor.